The idea that we've been playing with today was the idea of human experience and suffering, and how Scripture, especially in John 11, deals with human experience and suffering. And so that's what got us started, and we went on for about an hour and a half, 2 hours, and it was great, and I wish we had recorded it, and we hadn't. And at the same time, I don't want to rehash the whole conversation like we're just now having it or something. So that didn't seem fair. But I was thinking afterwards, in this podcast, in general in the podcast, that connection of Scripture to the human experience, I think, is really interesting. And I know it's interesting to you, that we often read Scripture and we're reading it either intellectually, or we're reading it for some deep spiritual insight, or we're reading it because our parents told us to. There's all these different reasons we read it. And one of the things I think that is helpful to do is to slow down when we're reading it and try and feel what the people in the text are feeling, which is impossible to do completely accurately because we're not them. But I think we can approximate some of it, and it helps. So today we were looking at some people that had lost their brother. So I think to start with that is you ask the question, have you ever had a family member die?
I haven't had a significant family member die.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Like not a mom, not a dad, not a brother or sister. I had a grandmother die, but I was young, and so I didn't really feel the weight of that, and I didn't really know her as well. So I have not experienced that type of loss before in my family.
Can you think of someone who is close to you who has?
I don't feel like necessarily close, but I went to school with someone who had passed away due to a car accident in college.
Okay.
And that was kind of a weird moment because it wasn't like I was experiencing the direct loss, because I don't want to pretend or make it seem like I knew the person super well. But we ran around in the same friend groups, and it was a small college, so it was kind of like you knew everybody to some extent. When that person passed away, that was kind of like, it made me internalize, oh, that's right, I'm going to die one day. And they were 22 and I was 21. Yeah. I'm like, I'm going to die one day. And then it was just a weird type of suffering that everybody experienced. Like, they were processing their own loss, they were processing their own life, and they grieved the loss that they had. Have you had, is there a moment, is there a family member, is there a loved one that you've had in your circle who has passed away that left you feeling some sort of suffering?
First one that comes to mind is my dad. He's in Kansas. He was in Kansas. Now, my dad, when I grew up, was kind of a different man than my dad was at his dying. So when I grew up, he was self-employed carpenter, strong guy, that kind of person, really, really whip smart. He could just do all kinds of stuff. And then he had this brain tumor when I was a teenager that really kind of messed him up. But he was recovering from that. Then when I was a young adult, he had a stroke that wasn't like a major stroke, but it was enough to take mobility and it really damaged his brain even more. So by the time he got to the time where he was dying, he was in some ways a different man than he was before.
Right.
So that would be the closest person that comes to mind. And it sent me all around the feelings. The suffering that my mom was going through, suffering my sister was going through, the suffering that I was going through.
What were some of the ways that you grieved that suffering?
Emotionally distant at first, as I was thinking more logically, how do I get to Kansas? How does, when's Amanda going to come with the kids? How do I be there for my mom and my sister and all that stuff? So there was that kind of numb kind of experience. Yeah. He was still in the hospital. He was on a form of life support.
Okay.
And he had been, since the aneurysm, losing cognition rapidly. So I guess when my mom, I think, when she discovered him, he was out of it. But there was some slight responsiveness to him. By the time I got there to Wichita, there was no responsiveness left.
Right.
But there he was in a hospital setting with a few tubes and some stuff going on, and they were keeping him alive.
Yeah.
So the kind of the next thing that hit me was just a wave of emotion just kind of washed over when I saw him. There's something you said earlier, and we were talking about Mary and Martha. If you can read between the lines in the scripture, because it doesn't give you a full description of their mental makeup or their emotional makeup. But if you can read between the lines, you do notice that Martha is reacting differently than Mary is.
Yeah.
And we talked about that. And it just, as we've been going through this conversation, I think I was looking for the theological meaning of Martha's description of suffering versus Mary's description of suffering, because that's often what I do as a pastor. Is I'm looking for, right, here's what John is saying about what happened. John has an agenda. He wants us to hear something. What does he want us to hear? I think you hit the nail on the head. They are also two very different women, though in the same family, just like me and my sister were in the same family. They experience the grief and loss of their brother differently. Now I have to go from memory. I think Martha was the first one that Jesus ran into.
Yeah.
And she comes to Jesus and says, "Man, I wish you were here. Something could have happened differently."
Right.
And
like he might still be alive if you were here. Kind of
right.
Yeah.
And then Jesus says, he gives her like a word of theological depth, like a long-term view and eternal perspective, sort of, in like 2 lines. And it kind of reminds me of the woman at the well. And I know we keep going back to her, but it was a similar conversation. Like she's at the well. Jesus says, "Can I have some water?" She says, "I'm not sure I'm the one that give you this water." And he goes theological, right? He goes meaning, gives her a word. And it kind of felt like that with Martha. But with Mary, it didn't. It's like with Martha, he's talking about the resurrection. She says, "Yes, I believe in it." Like that's where he is with her. But with Mary, he moves to Mary, and Mary like just falls at his feet and says kind of the same thing that Martha did. "Wish you had been here," or something like that. If you had been here, it would have been different. Yeah. And to her, he reacts a little differently.
It leads me to Jesus often meets us where we're at. Like he meets us where we're at. Okay. In our suffering.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean it makes the suffering easier. It doesn't mean it makes it any less painful. But he meets us where we're at with how we're wired and how he's wired us. He met Martha in a different place and he met Mary in a different place. And I'm sure there were other people that we don't even get clued in on that he met in a different place. It's the same response from both women. It's different ways that they acted out the response.
Yeah.
But Jesus also met them where they were at,
right,
in the type of response that they gave.
So how did he meet Martha where she was at?
So he met with, it feels like and it sounds like, a more even-keeled, matched tone to where she was at. She was probably, she was obviously grieving,
right,
and she was asking the question basically, why God? But you can also, right, you can do whatever.
Right.
And he met her with that theological piece.
On the same level.
On the same level, yeah.
She's meeting him at the word, and he's giving her a word, and it goes back and forth, and he gives her hope.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay, then.
And then Mary gets up quickly. She's moving in haste, and he responds to her weeping with weeping.
Meets right at the same.
He does the same thing. He gets on her level.
Yeah.
And it was the same thing. It was the same statement. And so he supplied what was needed emotionally to fit their individual needs.
All right.
And I think that's really cool, because I feel like the suffering was the same, because it was the same grieving that they were having over the same person, but he met it with a different tone that supplied what they needed, and that's really awesome, because that's the kind of God we have. And there might be people who are listening that have followed Jesus their whole life, and they're like, yeah, I know that God. And there are some people that are listening here and don't know Jesus or don't trust Jesus or have tons of questions and need to hear, this is the kind of God that we have.
God we have, yeah.
He meets you where you're at in your suffering. It doesn't mean that it's going to be easier,
right,
but it means that he will meet you with what you need in the right time, in the right space, in the right moment. And a day from now, a week from now, a month from now, a year from now, 15 years from now, you will see what the benefit or the byproduct or the blessing was through it.
Before you get to Lazarus, you get to all these people. And I think there's something John is sharing with us about suffering and hope, and the difficulty of hope in difficult circumstances, and false blessing versus true blessing, and all that stuff.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, hey, guys, thank you so much for joining us here at the Cutting Room Floor. Leave us a review. Rate us. If you think we're great, tell us we're great. If you think we're awful, you can tell us that we're awful. That's fine.
Correct us, too. I'm sure we missed something.
Oh, yeah. I feel we always miss everything.
We will.
I feel like we have to circle back like, oh, we should have thought about that or said that. But, yeah, anyway. Okay, cool. Well, awesome. We will see you guys next week on the Cutting Room Floor.
Yep. Amen.